Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're diving into a true story that honestly sounds totally impossible. We're looking at the life of a man who literally came face to face with the deadliest weapon in human history. Not just once, but in a twist of fate that completely defies all logic. You know, you hear historical stories and think, okay, that has to be a Hollywood movie script. But what we're talking about today is 100% factual. It is without a doubt one of the most astonishing survival stories ever recorded. And by the end of this, you're going to see why the sheer odds of this happening are almost too massive to even wrap your head around. Just put yourself in this guy's shoes for a second. Imagine somehow surviving the absolute deadliest bomb in history. You pull yourself out of the wreckage, you manage to escape a completely ruined city, you finally catch your breath, only to experience that exact same nightmare all over again just 3 days later. It sounds made up, right? But this actually happened to a man named Tsutomu Yamaguchi, and we're going to walk through the microscopic odds and the exact timeline of his survival. It's an unbelievable story of resilience, and it really shows just how fast an ordinary life can be flipped totally upside down. Section 1. The First Flash. Hiroshima. So picture this. It's the morning of August 6, 1945. Yamaguchi is a 30-year-old engineer, just wrapping up a completely routine business trip. His morning started off like any other day. He finishes up his business, he's walking towards the train station for his commute, and then he happens to look up. He spots a single aircraft flying high overhead. Just one. And then, in a matter of literally seconds, this blinding flash of light completely fills the sky. There was no giant air raid siren, no massive fleet of bombers, just one single bomb, followed by total, unimaginable devastation. And the physical toll on him was absolutely immediate. The sheer force of the blast violently threw him through the air. When he finally hit the ground, he had suffered serious burns all over his body, and the flash actually left him temporarily blind. But here's the crazy part. Amidst a city that had been almost entirely vaporized in a fraction of a second, he was battered, but he was alive. Against odds we can't even calculate, he somehow survived total, unprecedented destruction. Moving on to the next chapter, escaping to Nagasaki. Now, think about what you'd do in that situation. Most people, severely burned, temporarily blind, would have just stayed put, right? You'd wait for help, or you'd just be completely paralyzed by the shock of what just happened. But Yamaguchi made a very different choice. First, he somehow survives that initial blast. But then, incredibly, by the very next day, he actually manages to secure transportation out of the ruined city. The infrastructure is totally gone, the chaos around him must have been absolute, but he found a way. He was driven by this one desperate need. He had to make the grueling journey home to his wife and his young son in Nagasaki. It was a journey fueled purely by love, pushing through a level of pain most of us can't even fathom. Actually makes it. He gets back to Nagasaki, battered but breathing. He's reunited with his family, and he returns home believing, the worst is finally behind him. And who could blame the guy? Like, what are the chances of something like that ever happening again? He was so relieved, entirely unaware that the nightmare he thought he just escaped was actually following him right home. Which brings us to part 3, history repeats itself. So it's now the morning of August 9th, exactly 3 days after the first blast. And despite his severe burns and the massive trauma, this incredibly dedicated engineer actually reports back to work. Just imagine this scene for a second. He's standing in his office, covered head to toe in bandages, trying to convince his skeptical coworkers that a single bomb just wiped out an entire city. And they're struggling to believe him. I mean, it sounded completely unbelievable. But right at the very moment he's trying to explain the impossible, the room suddenly fills with a second blinding flash of light right outside the window. A second atomic bomb had just detonated directly over Nagasaki. Yeah, for the second time in just 3 days, Yamaguchi survived history's deadliest explosion. He literally lived through another ground zero. The blast wave completely rocked his city, and while his home did sustain damage from the explosion, an absolute miracle happened in the aftermath. His wife and his young son survived the attack right alongside him. The family he fought so incredibly hard to return to was safe, even as the world literally ended around them for a second time. I just want to pause here and think about the number 2 for a second. 2. The chances of living through just one atomic bombing are infinitesimally small. To be in that blast radius, be thrown violently through the air, and walk away alive, that is a miracle all by itself. But 2? One man surviving 2 atomic bombings, just 3 days apart. It is a singular mathematical anomaly in human history. It completely defies statistics, probability, and honestly, all logic. And that leads us to his final chapter, a legacy of peace.
After the war ended, you might expect a guy who went through all this to just immediately shout his story from the rooftops. But for years, Yamaguchi made a very quiet, human choice. He just focused on raising his family and rebuilding his life from the ashes. But later in life, this really beautiful transformation occurred. As he got older and his extraordinary story inevitably began to spread, he didn't hold on to bitterness or anger. Instead, he became a massive, strong voice for peace, desperately hoping that no one would ever have to experience what he endured. He realized that being the man who survived 2 atomic bombs gave him this totally unique, undeniable platform, and he used it to transform his impossible survival into a powerful, lasting advocacy. So what's the big takeaway here? Tsutomu Yamaguchi's life is absolute proof that reality is often way stranger than fiction. Some stories just sound too wild to be true, but this one really, truly happened. And it leaves us with a massive question to think about. In a world that still holds these weapons today, what can we learn from the man who survived them twice? How do we take a story of unimaginable destruction and use it to foster a real, lasting peace?